"You're demoted. Consider it a reality check," Vanessa Moore, my boss's daughter, announced in front of the entire office just minutes after I had been promoted. Laughter echoed, not because it was funny, but because no one dared to stand against her. HR shrugged when I protested, smirking as if my 20 years of service meant nothing. My so-called best friend avoided my eyes, pretending he didn't know me. I walked out humiliated, carrying the weight of betrayal on my shoulders. 4 hours later, my phone buzzed endlessly. 96 missed calls. All from the same company that had just buried me. I had worked in that building for 20 years, quietly, steadily, never the loudest voice in the room, never the one chasing shortcuts. People used to joke that I was the company's backbone. Always there, never bending. On that morning, when my name was finally called and the announcement of my promotion rang out, I felt something break loose inside me, like a dam holding back decades of patience and sacrifice. Applause filled the conference hall. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to imagine telling my wife, watching my daughter's eyes light up when she heard that her father was now a director. She had drawn a picture just a week ago, holding up a crayon sketch that read, "Daddy's a hero." The ovation swelled, but amidst the cheers, I caught something different, a pair of eyes from the back row, sharp and narrowed, refusing to clap. It wasn't just disinterest, it was resentment. A seed of unease planted itself in my chest, though I pushed it aside. Today was supposed to be mine. After all the nights spent fixing code until sunrise, the birthdays I had missed, the hospital visits to my mother I had cut short to rush back to the office, today was vindication. Yet even as I smiled, a shadow lingered in my thoughts. 2 days earlier, I had stumbled across a vulnerability in the company's internal system. Nothing catastrophic, but serious enough that if left unfixed, it could lead to disaster. I had wrestled with whether to report it immediately, but exposing it now, on the eve of my promotion, felt like handing my enemies a weapon. So I kept it quiet, intending to patch it silently in the weeks to come. Was it cowardice or pragmatism? I told myself it was for the greater good. Sometimes silence protects more than words. Have you ever chosen to keep a secret? Not for yourself, but for the people around you. That's the kind of secret I carried into that hall. The CEO spoke about loyalty, dedication, and integrity, words that resonated because they described exactly how I had lived my professional life. My colleagues raised their glasses. Mark, the man I once considered my closest ally, clapped with the same rhythm as everyone else. Yet his eyes didn't quite meet mine. Perhaps it was just my imagination, but something about his applause felt mechanical, almost rehearsed. I tried not to dwell on it. Instead, I let myself enjoy the moment, savoring the rare taste of recognition. My phone buzzed in my pocket with a text from my wife. "We're so proud of you. Dinner tonight, your favorite." I typed back, "Wouldn't miss it for the world." For the first time in years, I meant it. Then a sound cut through the laughter and chatter, the sharp, deliberate rhythm of high heels striking the polished floor. It grew louder, closer, until the doors swung open. Conversations faltered, heads turned. I didn't have to see her face to know who it was. The air in the room shifted with her presence. Vanessa Moore, the CEO's daughter, walked in with a confidence that came not from merit, but from entitlement. Her gaze swept over the room like she owned every soul inside it. A chill threaded through me as her eyes locked on mine, carrying the same resentment I had noticed earlier. The applause dwindled into silence. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Only the sharp edge of someone who believed power was their birthright. In that instant, before she even spoke, I knew my day of triumph was about to be rewritten. The silence that followed Vanessa's entrance clung to the walls long after her words had cut me down. Days passed in a haze, the sting of humiliation replaying in my mind. My promotion had vanished like smoke, replaced by a humiliating demotion announced in front of my peers. But as the anger cooled, something heavier settled in. Suspicion. Her confidence hadn't been improvised. It had been rehearsed, calculated. One evening, long after most of the office had emptied, I sat staring at my inbox, scrolling through archived messages. That was when I noticed it, a string of internal emails buried in the system. They weren't meant for me, but someone had carelessly copied me by mistake weeks earlier. The subject line was harmless enough, succession planning, but the contents made my blood run cold. Positions, promotions, and entire departments had been mapped out like pieces on a chessboard, all centered around one name: Vanessa Moore. Every decision was preordained. Hard work, performance reviews, and loyalty were just illusions to keep people like me compliant. I leaned back, heart pounding. 20 years of dedication had been nothing more than theater, a show staged to make me believe merit mattered. My promotion was never mine to begin with. It had only been a placeholder until Vanessa decided otherwise. I thought of Mark, my so-called friend. He had been oddly distant lately, avoiding direct eye contact, cutting conversation short whenever the topic of leadership came up. A gnawing suspicion grew inside me. That night, I stayed late, pretending to finish paperwork. From my office window, I saw him slip into Vanessa's office. The door closed. The light stayed on for nearly an hour. When he finally emerged, his face was flushed, his phone in hand, typing rapidly. The realization hit like a knife. Mark wasn't just another employee. He was her eyes and ears, feeding her information, keeping her ahead of everyone else. Betrayal had many faces, but none cut deeper than the face you once trusted. Have you ever believed someone stood beside you, only to discover they'd been digging the hole you fell into? The self-disgust was almost worse than the anger, because I had been blind enough to believe his friendship was real. I was about to leave when something caught my eye. My desk drawer, locked when I'd left it earlier, was slightly ajar. Inside, on top of the neatly stacked files, lay a small black USB drive. No note, no explanation. Just the device waiting like bait. My first instinct was paranoia. Was it a trap, planted by Vanessa to catch me snooping? But curiosity clawed stronger than fear. I slipped it into my pocket, waiting until I was safely at home before plugging it into my laptop. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a single folder appeared. Moore, Consortium. Inside were dozens of files, charts, and flow diagrams. What I saw made my stomach lurch. It wasn't just this company. It was an entire network, subsidiaries, shell corporations, offshore accounts, all tied back to the Moore family. Promotions, demotions, even firings had been orchestrated across multiple branches. Nepotism wasn't the disease of one office. It was the bloodstream of an empire. I stared at the web of deceit spreading across my screen. Names of colleagues connected by arrows to Vanessa and her father, their careers manipulated like puppets on strings. At the center of it all was Vanessa herself, positioned not just as an executive in waiting, but as the heir to a dynasty of corruption. The room seemed colder. My daughter's drawing, "Daddy's a hero," sat taped to the edge of my monitor, mocking me with its innocence. I clenched my fists. Hero? How could I explain to her that her father had spent 2 decades feeding a machine designed to reward the unworthy and punish the loyal? The USB's final file stopped me cold. A timeline. Not just for Vanessa's rise, but for my own removal. My promotion had always been temporary, a cruel step before the fall. Every detail of my career had been calculated, my loyalty exploited until the day they no longer needed me. The betrayal cut deeper than words could describe, but beneath the despair, a new feeling stirred. Resolve. If they thought I would quietly vanish into the shadows, they had underestimated me. I wasn't just a casualty, I was a witness, and witnesses carry weight. I closed the laptop, heart pounding, mind racing. Who had left that USB in my drawer? A friend? A fellow victim? Or someone testing whether I had the courage to act? Whatever the answer, I knew one thing. I could no longer stay silent. The world I had devoted my life to was rotten at its core, and now I had proof. The only question was, what was I willing to risk to expose it? The summons arrived in the middle of the week, crisp white paper with my name printed in bold. Mandatory disciplinary hearing. No explanation, no details. Just a time and a room number. I knew what it meant. They weren't going to fire me quietly. They were going to make a spectacle of it, the same way Vanessa had humiliated me before. The conference room was colder than usual, its walls lined with familiar faces, pretending they weren't enjoying the drama. At the center sat David Turner from HR, expression smug and rehearsed. Beside him, Mark avoided my eyes, shuffling through a stack of papers as though he were preparing for a trial. Vanessa leaned back in her chair at the end of the table, arms folded, her smirk carved like stone. David began reading aloud. Allegations of financial misconduct, manipulated invoices, unauthorized transfers. Each charge was accompanied by a document, conveniently discovered by the internal audit. My name was stamped across them like an execution order. I could almost admire the craftsmanship. The forgeries were flawless. "Richard," David said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy, "we know this is difficult, but the evidence is undeniable. You've been siphoning funds, and frankly, we're stunned you thought you could get away with it." A ripple of whispers spread across the room. Some colleagues glanced at me with pity, others with disgust. I caught Mark's eye for just a second. He looked almost proud, like a man finally proving his loyalty to power. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. Instead, I smiled. Because this, too, I had anticipated. If they thought fabricating evidence would corner me, they hadn't realized how closely I had been watching them. My silence unnerved them more than any denial could have. Vanessa leaned forward, her voice smooth like a blade. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Richard? Any last defense?" Before I could respond, a voice rose from the back of the room. "This is a farce." Heads turned. Anna, a quiet analyst from the compliance department, stood with trembling hands but steady eyes. "I've seen those documents. They were altered, and I know who altered them." She turned her gaze toward Mark. The room erupted in murmurs. Mark's face drained of color. He stammered, searching for words, but Anna pressed on. "You think no one notices, but I keep logs. Every access, every edit. The files you claim are evidence. Mark touched them first." For a moment, chaos reigned. David slammed his hand on the table, shouting for order, while Vanessa's smirk faltered, her eyes narrowing at Anna like a predator deciding whether to strike. I watched quietly, savoring the shift. They hadn't expected anyone to stand against them. Anna's voice might not be enough to save me, but it cracked the illusion of their control. Vanessa leaned toward David, her lips moving in a whisper I barely caught. "He's smarter than I thought." The words were meant to be private, but they carried across the tense silence like smoke curling from a fire. The meeting dissolved into confusion, half the room demanding proof, the other half staring at me as though I held answers. I said nothing. Instead, I gathered the stack of forged documents, glanced at them with detached amusement, and slipped them into my folder. Back at my desk, I closed the blinds and opened my laptop. My hands didn't tremble as I inserted the USB, copying files, connecting them with the evidence I had been collecting for weeks. The diagrams of nepotism, the forged signatures, the financial discrepancies. They painted a picture darker than anyone wanted to admit. I typed out a message, attached the files, and hovered over the send button. I didn't include a recipient name in my notes. Maybe it was a journalist, maybe a regulator, maybe someone in law enforcement. I just knew the world outside these walls needed to see. With one click, the data transferred. Somewhere beyond my office, the truth was now loose, no longer chained to me alone. I leaned back, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The war had just changed. They thought they had staged my downfall, but I had just placed the first stone in the avalanche. The news broke faster than I imagined. By the next morning, headlines plastered across financial outlets screamed scandal. Moore Corporation under fire for fraudulent practices. Stock tickers bled red, investors dumped shares, and panicked chatter filled trading floors. The once untouchable empire began to wobble, the cracks widening with every passing hour. Inside the office, chaos replaced the polished routine. Meetings were canceled, phones rang without pause, and the glossy veneer of stability peeled away. Vanessa stormed through the halls, her composure gone, barking orders no one dared follow. She had always walked with the air of a queen. Now, she looked more like a cornered animal. David Turner, the smug HR chief, who had once smirked at my humiliation, was the first casualty. His name appeared in leaked memos, tying him directly to fabricated employee evaluations and financial manipulation. By noon, his office was empty, his name scrubbed from the directory. Some whispered he'd been forced out. Others claimed he'd been fired to appease regulators. Either way, his fall was swift, and no one shed a tear. I watched the implosion unfold from my desk, but I knew better than to think it was all my doing. By mid-afternoon, another wave of documents surfaced online. They weren't from me. Emails, audio recordings, internal audits, all exposing further rot. The details were too precise, too damaging to have come from an outsider. Someone else inside the company was fighting the same war. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to relief. I wasn't alone. But the question gnawed at me. Who was the shadow in the dark? The one throwing fuel onto the fire I had sparked? Were they ally or opportunist? My instincts told me both possibilities were dangerous. The effect was undeniable. Panic swept through the boardrooms. Executives who once looked untouchable were suddenly avoiding their offices, canceling appearances, retreating into silence. Clients withdrew contracts, banks froze accounts, and every hour brought a new headline that made survival seem less likely. In the cafeteria, I overheard whispers. "It's over. The Moore family can't survive this." Another voice responded, trembling. "Do you think we'll still get paid this month?" The empire was rotting in real time, and its employees were no longer worshippers, but survivors scrambling for the nearest exit. Late that afternoon, as I packed my bag to leave, a hush fell across the floor. Heavy footsteps echoed, not the hurried clatter of frightened workers, but the deliberate march of authority. Men in dark suits entered the building, their jackets marked with the insignia no one dared ignore, the FBI. Gasps rippled across the office as agents fanned out, their presence as suffocating as it was inevitable. Badges flashed, folders handed over, computers seized. The empire of Moore was no longer just under scrutiny, it was under siege. From the corner of my eye, I saw Vanessa standing frozen near her office door. For the first time, she looked small. The woman who had once smirked while stripping me of dignity now seemed like a child caught in a storm too big to control. Her lips moved, muttering to herself, eyes darting like a caged animal. I didn't linger. I slipped past the commotion, out into the cool evening air, my heart heavy but steady. This was the beginning of the collapse, the dominoes falling one by one. And though I had pushed the first piece, the avalanche had grown beyond my control. But somewhere, in the middle of the chaos, the question remained. Who else had joined the fight? Who was the ghost that had chosen to burn the house down with me? The FBI raid scattered Moore Corporation like leaves in a storm. Executives vanished overnight. Investors abandoned ship. And Vanessa herself had disappeared from the office, her phone going straight to voicemail. I thought it was over, that the empire had collapsed, and the truth would finish the job. But one evening, just as I was settling into the quiet of my home, a knock rattled my front door. Standing there wasn't an agent or a journalist. It was Harold Moore himself, the CEO, father of Vanessa, and the man whose name had built the empire now burning to ash. He looked nothing like the titan plastered across Forbes covers. His suit hung loose on his frame, his face sagged with exhaustion, and his eyes carried the desperation of a drowning man. "Richard," he said softly, "we need to talk." Against my better judgment, I let him in. My wife hovered protectively in the hallway, her arms crossed, her eyes suspicious. But I gestured for her to stay back. Harold followed me into the living room, sinking into the armchair, like a man who hadn't sat down in days. "You think I'm the villain," he began, voice trembling. "You think I orchestrated all of this. But the truth is, I've been a prisoner as much as you." I nearly laughed. A prisoner? The man who had stood at the helm, who had allowed his daughter to humiliate loyal employees, who had signed the documents that built this empire of lies. My silence must have shown my disbelief, because he leaned forward urgently. "There's a network, Richard. Bigger than Moore, bigger than any single company. They control boardrooms, banks, government contracts. Dozens of corporations, maybe hundreds, dance to their tune. I built this company, yes, but I ceded control years ago when I accepted their backing. Every decision I made after that was under their shadow. Even Vanessa's rise wasn't truly my choice. She was positioned by them, trained by them. I couldn't stop it if I tried." "Shaw," the words chilled me. A part of me wanted to dismiss it as the rambling of a desperate man, but the conviction in his eyes told me otherwise. If he was telling the truth, then everything I thought I'd toppled was just one domino in a far larger chain. "Help me," Harold said suddenly, his voice breaking. You've already started tearing down their walls. With your evidence, with the leaks, you've wounded them in a way I never could. But they'll come for you next. Unless we work together, you'll be destroyed. My family, my legacy, it's all I have left. Please, Richard, don't let them erase me. I stared at him, torn between disgust and a grudging flicker of pity. Here was the man who had allowed my humiliation, who had sacrificed my dignity for his own survival. And yet, there was truth in his desperation. He wasn't pleading as a king begging for power. He was pleading as a man trying to survive the fall. Before I could answer, a faint creak echoed from the hallway. My instincts sharpened. I moved toward the door, but it was too late. Vanessa stepped into the living room, her face pale, but her eyes burning with venom. She must have followed her father here, listened to every word. "So this is your plan, father," she spat. "Begging scraps from the man you destroyed? Pathetic." Her gaze shifted to me. "And you, Richard, you think you're winning. You're nothing but a pawn. They'll swallow you alive." The room pulsed with tension. Harold reached for her, but she recoiled. "Stay out of my way," she warned, her voice shaking with fury. Then she turned and stormed out, leaving silence in her wake. I looked back at Harold, who buried his face in his hands. She doesn't understand. She thinks she's untouchable, but they'll eat her alive too. I stood there, torn. To side with Harold meant acknowledging his weakness, perhaps even forgiving his betrayal. To refuse meant standing alone against a machine too vast for one man. My choice would shape more than my own survival. It would shape the future of everyone caught in this web. That night, sleep evaded me. I sat at my desk, staring at the files I had collected, at the network of corruption branching like a diseased tree. My phone buzzed with a message from an encrypted account. "You are not alone. We've been waiting for someone to stand up." The next morning, I followed the thread. The account led me to a hidden channel where others gathered. Employees from different corporations, whistleblowers who had been silenced, victims of the same invisible hand. They called themselves the Network. Their stories mirrored mine. Promotions stolen, reputations destroyed, careers dismantled for the sake of nepotism and greed. I realized then that my fight wasn't just personal. I was part of something larger, a collective scar waiting to become a weapon. Some of them already had connections inside regulatory bodies. Others had evidence stored for years, waiting for the right moment. Together, we were more dangerous than the Moors ever imagined. That evening, I visited my mother in her small house. She had aged quickly in recent years, her body frail, but her mind still sharp. As I sat by her bedside, she reached for my hand. "Son," she whispered, "you've ended what your father couldn't. He worked under the same shadows. He wanted to fight, but he was too afraid. You've done what he never dared." Her words sank into me, a mixture of pride and burden. On the drive home, I couldn't shake the weight of choice pressing on me. The files I held could annihilate not just more corporation, but an entire constellation of companies tied to the hidden consortium. The blast radius would be catastrophic. Innocent employees would lose jobs, families would be ruined. Yet to hold back would mean letting the guilty escape, letting the machine rebuild stronger than before. I thought of Harold, broken in my living room. I thought of Vanessa, her arrogance blinding her to the wolves circling. And I thought of my daughter, who once called me a hero. What kind of hero stays silent when the truth demands to be heard? Have you ever stood on the edge of a decision so immense it could destroy lives, yet save countless others? That was where I found myself, hand hovering over the key that would unleash it all. I returned to my desk, the glow of my laptop casting long shadows in the quiet house. My finger trembled over the enter key, the files ready to send to every journalist, every regulator, every authority that could touch the untouchable. One press, and the world would know. One press, and the machine would bleed. But once unleashed, there would be no turning back. I closed my eyes, hearing my mother's voice, my daughter's laughter, Harold's plea, Vanessa's venom. And then I pressed down. The screen blinked. The files sent. A flood of truth rushing into the world beyond me. The web had been exposed. The only question left was whether it would strangle them or all of us. The storm had passed, at least on the surface. Moore Corporation was gutted, its executives under investigation, its stock nothing more than a warning sign on Wall Street. Vanessa had vanished from public view, her name whispered in gossip columns, but nowhere in business journals. Harold faced hearings, his once commanding voice reduced to stammering denials. And me? I found myself at a crossroads. Weeks after the leaks, an email arrived in my inbox. It wasn't from a recruiter or a headhunter. It was from a group of former executives who had once been victims themselves. They had walked away years earlier, stripped of promotions, scapegoated for mistakes they hadn't made, buried by the same system that had nearly destroyed me. Now they had built something new, a company founded on transparency, shared responsibility, and merit. They wanted me to join them, not as an employee, but as a partner, a leader who understood what it meant to be betrayed and still stand tall. Walking into their headquarters felt like stepping into another world. There were no gold-plated plaques, no nepotistic portraits on the walls, no hierarchy that placed family above ability. Instead, the energy was different, electric, raw, hopeful. For the first time in years, I believed in the possibility of honest work. One morning, I stood at the doorway of my daughter's room, watching her lace her shoes for school. She looked up at me, wide-eyed, surprised to see me holding her backpack. "Are you coming with me, Daddy?" she asked. I smiled, taking her hand. "Yes, sweetheart. Today I am." We walked to school together, the morning sun spilling across the pavement. It was such a simple act, but to me, it felt like redemption. The look on her face, pure joy, was worth more than any title I had ever chased. Yet life has a way of reminding you that peace is temporary. On my second week at the new job, I discovered a detail that stopped me in my tracks. The founders, the very people who had invited me, were once high-ranking at Moore before being pushed out. They weren't just survivors. They were former insiders who had lived the same nightmare and rebuilt from the ashes. I wasn't joining strangers. I was joining kin. That revelation filled me with pride, but also unease. If corruption had followed them once, could it return? Could even the noblest intentions sour when ambition grew? I didn't voice my doubts, but they lingered like shadows. Late one evening, after finishing a presentation, I returned to my desk to find a new message waiting. It wasn't spam, nor was it a casual note. The subject line was a single word: help. Attached was a file of internal memos from a company I had never worked for. Different name, different faces, but the same machinery of nepotism grinding loyal workers into dust. My pulse quickened. Was this a plea from another whistleblower? Or a trap? Either way, The pattern was unmistakable. The cancer I had fought hadn't been eradicated. It had only shifted hosts. I closed the laptop, staring into the darkness of my office. The war wasn't over. The dominoes hadn't all fallen. The next morning, as I dropped my daughter off at school, she hugged me tight and whispered, "You're my hero, Daddy." Her innocence was a blade and a shield all at once. I realized then that whatever battles lay ahead, I couldn't retreat. Not while others were still trapped in the same cage I had escaped. Moore Corporation's ruins became headlines of yesterday. Vanessa disappeared into silence. Harold faced trial. David Turner was reportedly seen scrubbing floors at a shopping mall, his smirk replaced by a mop bucket. People said justice had been served, but I knew better. Justice was never final. It was a constant fight. With the settlement money from class action lawsuits, I established Silent Justice, a foundation dedicated to protecting workers from exploitation, giving them resources to fight back without fear. Letters poured in. Stories echoed mine. Each one a reminder that betrayal in the workplace was universal, not confined to one building or one family name. On my daughter's birthday, for the first time, I was there from the candles to the cake, from the laughter to the bedtime story. No phone call dragged me away. No crisis demanded my absence. As I watched her blow out the candles, I felt something unshakable. Not just relief, but purpose. That night, as I cleaned up the wrapping paper, a knock came at the door. A familiar face stood in the doorway. An old colleague who had once mocked me for resisting, eyes now filled with remorse. "You inspired us," he said quietly. "The fight has just begun. Others are ready to stand. We're waiting for your lead." I closed the door after him, my mind heavy with the weight of his words. Upstairs, my daughter slept soundly, her small breaths steady in the quiet night. I sat beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and whispered into the dark, "Daddy kept his promise." The battle against corruption was not over, but my legacy had already begun, not in boardrooms or courtrooms, but in the eyes of my child, and in the fire I had lit in those who once thought themselves powerless.